Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear friends of the Körber-Stiftung, of the EFSH, and also of the Carnegie Endowment. Very warm welcome to the launch of the digital report of the Körber Strategic Stability Initiative. The title is Changing Our Collective Fate, the Future of Great Power Competition and Strategic Stability. Now, you may say that the Körber-Stiftung has a bit of a penchant for dramatic titles, but I think that in the case of our issue today, there is really no way of exaggerating the importance of the issue. Even the term strategic stability, which had gone out of fashion for quite some time, has made an astounding comeback. So what is this Körber Strategic Stability Initiative all about now? Along with our friends and colleagues at the EFSH, we felt that we need to do something. We need to do something at a time of a deepening great power competition and of a crumbling of the existing arms control architecture. And that is what we did. And we brought together beautiful, bright minds from the US, from China, from Europe, and from Russia. And we tasked them to come up with new ideas for peaceful cooperation, and also to think about, or maybe I should say to rethink, the concept of strategic stability and the future of arms control. Now, when I say this, I'm reminded of Richard von Weizsäcker. Richard von Weizsäcker, our former German president and also the longtime chairman of our Bergedorf Roundtable. And he once said, disarmament is important, but history teaches us that most often it is not disarmament that leads to peace, but peaceful cooperation. Peaceful cooperation that leads to less mistrust, less fear, and eventually disarmament. Well, I think he was right. And this is also very much the spirit of cooperation in which we conducted this program. Yes, the recent Biden-Putin Summit has brought strategic stability back on the agenda, but I'm convinced that this is not only a US-Russian file, but that we also need to bring China into this conversation. And therefore, our quadrilateral group of experts, if you will, has developed 19, not more and not less, 19 policy recommendations in a series of virtual meetings over the past year and a half. And at the core of all those meetings was one fundamental question, namely how to prevent great power competition from escalating into open military conflict. Now, we transformed the recommendations and the findings of this process into an innovative and interactive website that I am very enthusiastic about. And if you want to know what strategic stability is, why it is important, and how it can be strengthened, then this is your place to be and your place to go, www.strategicstability.org. And I hope you find it as interesting and as exciting as I do. Now, we're thrilled to launch the findings of this process today in cooperation with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And what we have in store for you is, first of all, Uli Kühn from the EFSH. He will give you a brief overview of the report, the digital report, and some selected policy recommendations. And then afterwards, under the wise chairmanship, or I should say chairwomanship of Liana Fix, we will discuss the policy recommendations with our panelist, whom Liana will introduce a little later. And be sure there will be enough time for you to engage, to ask questions, and to make comments as well. Now, before I pass on the mic to James Acton from the Carnegie Endowment in DC, let me say some thank yous. First of all, a very big thank you to the EFSH, who's been a superb partner over the process, and also many thanks for contributing to making the interactive website possible. A second big thank you goes to the participants of the process and of the group for their dedication throughout the time of 15+ months, and also their intellectual stamina. Thank you also, of course, to the Carnegie Endowment for the opportunity to cooperate on this launch, and also a special thank you to Tung Zhao, who participated in the Körber Strategic Stability Initiative. I would also mention here James Acton and Erin McLaughlin, who have been very instrumental in making this possible. Last, but certainly not least, a special thanks goes to my fantastic team at the Körber-Stiftung, to Diana Fix and Christoph Heilmeier, together with Leonie Stamm, Anna Pröhl, and Philipp Lott. Now, finally, without much further ado, James, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Nora. And on behalf of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, it's a great pleasure to be involved in hosting this virtual launch today. I know it was also an honor for my colleague Tung Zhao to be part of this initiative. You know, when you're thinking about planning an event, you spend a long time thinking about what the right timing is. And just occasionally something happens in the world that turns an important event into an important and urgent one. And yesterday we heard the news that China appears to be building in excess of 100 new silos for its ICBMs. I think this is part of a global nascent nuclear arms race. And I think you should be able to agree with that, irrespective of how you view China's silo building. You can think, as I largely do, that it's essentially a defensive reaction to a perceived first strike threat from the United States. Or you can think it's an offensive thing that requires a reaction by the United States. But either way, I think that whichever interpretation you go down, it shows the interactivity, the dynamism, the way that weapons programs in one state are often a consequence or require a response by a second state. Now, having said there's a nascent global nuclear arms race, which I think there is, there's also some more positive signs on the horizon. In spite of all the challenges facing the arms control regime, we've seen the presidents of the United States and Russia agree to hold a strategic stability dialogue. When it comes to China, I think the new US administration's position is more reasonable in terms of what it wants from China in terms of engagement and cooperation, though we'll have to see whether or not China's willing to engage. But against this background, I think the report that's being launched today, part of the Körber Strategic Stability Institute, which was organized by Körber-Stiftung and the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg, is a really both important and timely piece of work. Nora's already told you a lot about it. You know, I would just say, as somebody who spends a lot of time management, like the scale of this task was extremely impressive. 1.5 years, experts from the United States, China, Russia, and Germany, 8 sessions under conditions of COVID, and to get such a diverse group of that, to get such a diverse group as that, to agree to 19 recommendations was really kind of a remarkable achievement. I think I'll just close by encouraging everyone to check out their new interactive website, www.strategicstability.org, which I had a look at this morning for the first time and was absolutely excellent. And now let me hand over to the director of the Institute for Peace Research at the University of Hamburg, and more importantly, my former colleague at Carnegie and friend, Ulrich Kuhn.
Thank you so much, James, for your kind welcoming remarks. And of course, thanks to Nora, our dear project partner at the Körber Foundation. My name is Ulrich Kuhn, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of IFSH Hamburg. Now, this project, even in times of Corona, has been a lot of fun. Particularly, it was great discussing strategic stability, not only between the usual Western scholars, but also with experts from Russia and China. And in that regard, let me just recall what Nora and James already said. I particularly would like to thank Tung Zhao for his excellent input and help in organizing this launch event today. Now, as you all know already, the idea of the project was to have an interactive website which explains what strategic stability is, what the history of strategic stability is, and finally, what can be done to strengthen strategic stability. Now, the web page itself contains 19 policy recommendations that have been developed jointly by our working group of Chinese, European, Russian, and US experts. And the big question they all engaged in was, how can we prevent great power competition from escalating into open conflict? How can we do that jointly together? Now, the website offers you an introduction first into what has become known as the paradigm of great power competition between the United States, China, and Russia. And the webpage then also contains a joint definition of all our experts on strategic stability. So I'm not saying that you have to use that for your next article that you're writing, but I think that it's really already a valid piece of work to have this diverse group of experts agree on a joint definition. And then it offers key regional perspectives on threats to and preconditions for strategic stability, meaning how do the Russians perceive that? What do the Chinese think of strategic stability? What are they worried about when it comes to the US and vice versa? Now, browsing the webpage, you will also find a timeline of key events, which demonstrates over the years to what extent strategic stability has actually been undermined in recent years. And of course, most importantly, in the end, the webpage contains our 19 policy recommendations. Now, those recommendations are then in the end subdivided into 3 groups. We group them into principles, low-hanging fruit, and more ambitious goals. And of course, you can all download the recommendations in English as well as in the German language. Now let's have a quick look at 5 specific policy recommendations. I'm not going to walk you through all 19 recommendations, but let's just focus on 5, which are of particular importance for our discussion later on. Now, the first one is policy recommendation number 1. And here our experts underscored that it is a precondition for strategic stability that great powers are willing to manage competition. Now, that might sound a bit obvious, but in fact, if you look at what that could mean in practice, you will notice that, for instance, a willingness to engage in compromise, refraining from the pursuit of strategic invulnerability, avoiding demands for unilateral concessions, and successful arms control policies are all not a given. Let's move on to the next recommendation, which is recommendation number 6. And this one goes to the Europeans. Here, our experts agreed that Europe should find its own voice in strategic stability talks. And here, most importantly, Europeans should develop and push their own specific arms control proposals in order to remain not simple bystanders in great power competition, but to engage in the debate. The next recommendation I want you to focus on is recommendation number 7. And this one focuses on what we call arms control socialization. Now, particularly transparency is not always met with enthusiasm by all parties. Now, as an interim measure, we suggest that the United States and Russia could engage in preparatory steps such as sharing and familiarizing third parties, meaning China, with basic arms control concepts, with procedures, with practices, and relevant expertise. Let's move to the next recommendation, number 12. This one is all about considering mixing systems as a model for trilateral arms control. Now, what could that mean? For example, the US, Russia, and China could aim to set a common limit for INF range and strategic systems for all 3 parties. Such an approach, what we called mix and match, could help address both the asymmetry in strategic weapons between the United States and Russia vis-à-vis China, as well as address China's large arsenal of INF range missiles. And with that, let's go to the last recommendation. That's recommendation number 19. And this is all about establishing norms for cyber competition in the nuclear domain. Here, priority should be given to mitigating the risks posed by cyber threats in the nuclear domain. And as an example for possible action, our experts came up with a code of conduct not to conduct cyber attacks against each other's nuclear early warning, command, control, and communications systems. Now, last but not least, of course, we're happy to see that our recommendation to restate the Reagan-Gorbachev statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore should never be fought has already been reinforced at the Geneva summit between Presidents Biden and Putin. And James already referred to that positive fact. Now, before I hand over to our moderator of today's session, let me thank particularly my IFSH colleague, Betty Sue, who is steering us through this meeting today and who has contributed a lot of effort and knowledge to the creation of this website. So big thank you to you, Betty. And now, without any further ado, I know that you're all waiting for the participants to engage in a debate about strategic stability. Liana, over to you. Thanks for moderating this panel discussion, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. Warm welcome also from my side. My name is Liana Fix. I'm the program director at Körber Foundation, and I had the pleasure to lead the project together with the EFSH in the last year and a half. The website and the policy recommendation do offer a lot of food for thought, so take your time to have a look at it and to scroll through it. And I'm looking forward to discuss these recommendations further in our panel discussion on the future of great power competition and strategic stability with great panelists. So a very warm welcome goes to Ambassador Richard Byrd, who is with us today and is not only the US chair, but also the president of Global Zero. He's also managing partner at McClarty Associates, and he was the US chief negotiator in the Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty talks with the former Soviet Union. We also have with us Rudiger, who's the Deputy Government Commissioner for Disarmament and Arms Control at the German Federal Foreign Office in Berlin. A warm welcome. We have with us Dmitry Trenin, Director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, also based in Moscow. And then we also have with us Tung Zhao, Senior Fellow in Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program, based at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and as already mentioned, a participant of our initiative. We're delighted to have such fantastic speakers who have found the time to join us today. Let me also say that we remain committed to equal representation of women in arms control and security policy, even though we were unfortunately not able to meet this goal in the preparation of this event. So without further ado, let's get started. I will kick off the discussion with some questions to our panelists before we bring in your questions and comments from the audience. So if you want to contribute to the discussion, you can use the raise hand button, the virtual hand, or you can use the Q&A function, and please feel free to already start questions now if you have them. So we will first turn to US-Russian talks before we then turn it over to China, given the news from yesterday. And my first question goes to Ambassador Richard Byrd. Ambassador, we saw at the Biden-Putin Summit that the spirit of Geneva seemed to have been revived with the Reagan-Gorbachev statement reaffirmed, but obviously Putin is not Gorbachev. So from your experience, what would be your advice to the US delegation how to make these upcoming talks and potential negotiations successful? And what would success look like?
Well, that's a very important question, and it's a big question. So I will try to answer it, but at the same time, be brief. You're right, Vladimir Putin is not Mikhail Gorbachev. But I do think that Vladimir Putin understands strategic nuclear issues and arms control. In the very few brief exchanges that I've had with him at various encounters, he has dwelled on issues like the problems that flowed from the US unilateral abrogation of the ABM treaty and the requirements that then created for the Russian side to build up its offensive forces. And more recently, his development of a new range of more modern, exotic nuclear weapons demonstrates Russia's continuing concerns, I think, about US strategic defenses. The big problem facing both, in my view, both the American and Russian side, as they think about the future of arms control into the 21st century, is the fact that modern technology is breaking down all of the familiar categories that made arms control possible in the past. When you talk about a strategic weapon, it's not clear whether you're in the current era, whether you're only talking about nuclear weapons or perhaps conventional weapons. When you're talking about the nuclear balance, it doesn't any longer, as James Acton's comments underscored, it isn't just a US-Russian balance. It increasingly will involve the Chinese. And by the way, I'll just note for as a footnote, the United Kingdom has recently made a decision to increase its number of strategic nuclear submarine-based systems. So the nuclear balance is becoming gone beyond bipolar. It's going multipolar, and this being able to distinguish between intercontinental range and regional and sub-regional systems is much more complicated. That tells me that what the Russians and the United States needs to do in the strategic stability dialogue going forward is begin to try to simplify the issue and begin to try to take some steps that will lead to embracing a larger number of weapons and potentially a larger number of participants. One important step will, in my view, will be need to move beyond simply warheads that are deployed and can be delivered over intercontinental range. We have to move to so-called sub-strategic nuclear weapons. Those are weapons, of course, that threaten our allies in Europe. They are warheads that are deployed by the Chinese, as was pointed out earlier, on INF range systems. That will require new approaches to counting weapons. It will also require much more elaborate verification systems. I believe that given the political emphasis that the Russian side places on being able to sit at the top table with the United States, that the Russians will be prepared to take these issues seriously, as long as the United States is viewed as also being serious in this effort. But I'll finish my comment by saying that with even the most constructive approach, we have to worry increasingly, it seems to me, in an era of great power competition about crisis management. And if I could point out maybe two examples from the Cold War, Berlin and Cuba, the equivalents, if you will, of those today are Taiwan, as involves the United States and China, and you just this week see a U.S.-Japanese naval exercise in response to the use of Chinese air power to intimidate the Taiwanese. And the other counterpart might be Crimea, where again you saw the Russians buzzing a UK naval destroyer. Again, crisis management could possibly lead to unintended escalation in a multipolar context where great powers are perhaps more nationalistic and populistic and want to flex their muscles.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. We will come back to the incident in a second, but just to follow up with one question, you already mentioned that both parties should simplify the agenda, but there seem to be different priorities. So the US side announced they want to talk about all nuclear weapons, and for Russia, it's obviously missile defense that has to come into the equation. Is there willingness in Washington to talk about missile defense in the upcoming talks?
Let me answer that two ways. Let me, first of all, and it's probably unfair to her because she's not part of this conversation, but I have talked about this issue with my friend and former colleague, Rose Gottemuller, who, as you know, negotiated for the U.S. the New START treaty. She at least has made the argument that as the Russian side has deployed these new, more exotic systems that that have this ability to stay aloft for 24 hours or to target underwater sort of nuclear armed long range torpedoes, that the Russian side is more comfortable about its ability to cope with U.S. strategic defenses than has been the case in the past. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly something that should be tested. But the second point I would make here is, the United States, despite all the concern that has existed for so long in Russian circles about U.S. strategic defense capabilities, those capabilities are still basically the size for dealing with small-scale nuclear attacks from countries like North Korea or potentially, say, Iran. They are not thick enough, they are not large enough, they are not capable enough to really deal with a Russian, or I would even go so far as to say a Chinese so-called first strike. So I think one way you deal with that is for the United States in the context of strategic stability talks. And I proposed this along with my colleague at Global Zero recently, John Wolfstall, is maybe the U.S. should provide its plans, its development and deployment plans for strategic defense for the coming decade, so that countries can understand what the United States intends to do. Because I don't believe any of those programs really would in any way, shape, or form seriously undermine the retaliatory capability of Russian forces.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let's bring in Dmitry Trenin from Moscow on exactly what Ambassador Byrd mentioned, the incident that we saw off the Crimean coast. In principle, the reaction in Moscow seemed to be quite positive towards the summit. But this new escalation also demonstrates that it's unclear how long this strategy of limiting the most dangerous risk, how long can the strategy last if we have so many crisis points where we can see inadvertent escalation?
Well, Liana, first of all, thank you for this invitation and congratulations on the report. It's a great contribution to international thinking about making the world a bit safer place. With regard to this incident, I think one purpose of the meeting in Geneva was to lay out the red lines that each party sees for itself. You don't have to accept those red lines, but you have to acknowledge them. What we saw off Crimea was testing those red lines by a British Navy ship. And I think the Russian response was fairly predictable. Actually, on the Russian side, the questions were raised, how come after the meeting in Geneva, you have a provocation of that kind that potentially could lead to a military collision with not so well understood consequences, unpredictable in my view. So the Russian question is just the opposite to the question that you have just raised. I think that in this case, deterrence was upheld at this level by the Russians, namely that red lines are what red lines are supposed to be. People may disagree about the legal status of Crimea, but one has to either accept the realities on the ground or be prepared to fight for one's own view of the realities or what the realities should be. And I think we are in this pretty inhospitable world, and we need to adapt to navigating, hopefully safely, in this pretty harsh environment.
Thank you, Dimitri. This is obviously also a task where NATO should come in at some point, and there have been recent efforts also by the Secretary General to increase NATO's efforts in arms control. Are these efforts at all being taken seriously in Moscow, or what is the reaction to these efforts?
Well, I'm not quite sure what the situation actually is. What I hear from the Russian side that basically what they would want is to have more military-to-military contacts with NATO so that incidents could be prevented, that if they happen, they could be managed in a crisis mode, and certainly not be allowed to escalate and lead to a conflict. And I think that's where we are. I would very much welcome a reestablishment of NATO-Russia regular contact at the military level, because that's the only level where you can hope to have productive contacts. I'm not talking dialogue, because dialogue is more about political issues, and I don't think we're there yet. But certainly we need to increase the mutual predictability of the two entities' activities on each other's borders. There are concerns in Russia with regard to this sea breeze exercise that NATO is now holding in the Black Sea. I'm sure there will be concerns with regard to Russia's coming exercises Zapad in Belarus, together with the Belarusian forces. And I think that those concerns need to be properly managed. I'm not sure that we can actually set the goal of putting them to rest. I don't think we're there yet, but certainly minimizing the concerns of the other side and making sure that there's no miscalculation, misperception of the other side's military activity. That would be a valid goal. But let me say that if there's going to be another test of the kind that HMS Defender has carried out close to Sevastopol, there would probably be a military engagement.
Thank you, Dimitri, for this assessment. Let us bring in Rudiger Bohn for a perspective from Europe and Germany. Germany and France tried to follow up to some extent on the Putin-Biden meeting with an EU-Russia summit, which was pushed by Merkel and Macron, which was rejected. And one of our recommendations says that Europe should find its own voice in strategic stability talks. How do you think can this be achieved if we have such divergent threat perceptions among Europeans? And what could be, from your perspective, concrete proposals that Europeans can actually contribute to prevent such escalations as described by Dimitri Trenin?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I would like to start with some more general remarks. The terms great power, competition, and strategic stability are currently used in a somewhat inflationary manner. Great power competition suggests that there are primarily three great powers, the US, Russia, China, that compete with each other simply because they are great powers. And this assessment would perfectly fit with what some scholars call the realistic school of, or realist school of thought. But I think it should not be overlooked that there is more to it. The US is a liberal democracy, and the other two powers are challenging the US because they rely on a different set of values. So I think this dimension should not be overlooked. And as to strategic stability, I had a look at the definition agreed upon at the Körber Strategic Stability Initiative. And the definition reminds me a little bit of Cold War thinking, stability understood as a balance of power based on parity with assured retaliatory capabilities, etc. And I wonder if this can still be the core of today's notion of strategic stability. The balance of power has dramatically shifted to the West, at least economically, and with NATO having 30 members today, most of them highly developed industrial states. Moreover, I'm afraid that this traditional understanding of strategic stability will perpetuate the dichotomy between the US and Russia. And I even feel that Russia might like to be, or might be interested in preserving this approach, which keeps Russia in the same league together with the US, although there's only one area where Russia can compete with the US, and this is the field of nuclear weapons. In short, I think that nuclear weapons, at least for Russia, have become a matter of status and prestige. And of course, if nukes are a matter of prestige and status and not merely of security, it will be difficult to solve the problem by means of deterrence and arms control. So does that mean that we don't need arms control anymore? Of course not. As long as there are nuclear weapons, it remains reasonable and important to have limits for nuclear arsenals and verification tools like the New START Treaty. Our security environment is, of course, more complex than the one of the Cold War and includes more and more domains. I think we need fresh ideas for arms control and CSBMs, in particular for risk reduction, ideas that go beyond counting tanks and aircraft, ideas that include rules for responsible behavior, which help to avoid the escalation of conflicts. So as to your question, we in Germany, of course, welcome the extension of the New START Treaty. We welcome the recent US-Russia summit and the prospect for strategic stability talks. And we welcome the reconfirmation of the Reagan-Gorbachev principle. By the way, all three measures are perfectly in line with the proposals of the so-called Stockholm Initiative, which is I think you have heard of it, it's a ministerial initiative of 16 member states that is aimed at in strengthening the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the NPT process. And the Stockholm Initiative also made 22 policy recommendations. 3 of the recommendations were exactly the measures that I just mentioned. So what can Germany do? What can Europe do to advance strategic stability, especially in the nuclear field? I think the most important thing is that we make clear what our priority are and that we discuss our priorities with our American partners in order to make our interests heard in the strategic talks that might be ahead of us. What are these priorities? For Germany, I see 3 fields. One field is we think that further reduction in strategic nuclear arsenals would make sense. Already back in 2013, then President Obama proposed an additional 1/3 reduction of strategic weapons in the framework of New START. I think this could be further explored. Secondly, I think we should broaden the scope, meaning we need to capture all Russian nuclear systems, and for Germany and Europe, of course, the Russian systems are the more immediate threat compared to China. And these systems include, of course, highly destabilizing so-called doomsday systems such as the Poseidon torpedo or the Burevestnik missile. And of course, as Europeans, we are particularly concerned about the massive qualitative and quantitative disparity in the field of non-strategic nuclear arsenals and dual-capable missiles, as it was just mentioned by Ambassador Byrd. Of course, a disparity that is in favor of Russia and that poses a threat to European security. The problem is that in the field of non-strategic or sub-strategic nuclear weapons, there is not much that the US or the West can offer because the Russian superiority is really overwhelming. And maybe here the mix and match approach proposed by the Körber Initiative and just mentioned by Ulrich Kühn can be a solution not only for trilateral arms control regimes, but also for the bilateral arms control relationship between the US and Russia. And thirdly, I think we should adapt to new technologies and security domains like artificial intelligence and weapon systems, hypersonic missiles, lethal autonomous weapon systems, space security, the cyberspace. This goes, of course, beyond the nuclear realm. But we see that these new emerging technologies or disruptive technologies and their military use are about to fundamentally change the nature of warfare, which impacts on deterrence and defense. There's a new complexity and ambiguity coming along with a high risk of miscalculation and unwanted escalation.
I think that's an important point that we will come back a little bit later to new technologies, if that is okay for the moment, because I think you already mentioned the point of reductions. I think that's an important point that we will have to discuss later, to what extent this really is a priority, reductions. But I would also like to bring in Tung Zhao to have a Chinese perspective also on what James Acton mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, a potential nuclear arms race emerging. So today is not only the 100-year anniversary of the Communist Party, but the news yesterday that China is building more than 100 missile silos is widely discussed. So perhaps Tung can give us a little bit of an insight what this means for China's status and perception as a nuclear power, and what it also means for efforts to bring China into arms control. Are these over now? Is it too late? Or what does the news from yesterday mean?
Thank you, Liana. It has been a great honor and pleasure to be part of this Körber Strategic Stability Initiative. I think people agree that China is making increasing efforts to modernize its nuclear forces. It has openly talked about the pursuit of a nuclear triad capability, something it has previously criticized the two major nuclear powers for doing. And this new news of China potentially building more than 100 silos for ICBMs is also interesting because it started a process in which China is now building up massively nuclear missile silos in the plain sight, which is different from its traditional practice of hiding its strategic nuclear missiles in mountainous areas and in underground facilities. So, I think it is accurate to say that with this trend, China is likely to, we are likely to see China conducting nuclear modernization at a faster speed than it has done over the past few decades. And I certainly worry that the US might react to this perceived Chinese expansionist nuclear policy, and we will end up in a negative action-reaction cycle. So there's a lot of strategic instability at play here. I think in the Chinese case, there are two levels of potential incentives behind recent Chinese nuclear modernization. One is at the technical level. I think China is indeed very worried about the potential impact of American homeland missile defense, nuclear counter-force strike capabilities, conventional precision strike capabilities, advanced space-based sensors that might track Chinese nuclear mobile missile vehicles, etc. And I'm glad that the Körber Strategic Initiative project participants have really examined these issues in depth in many online sessions. And also, I think there is another level of concern that is driving Chinese nuclear modernization, which is the geopolitical level. Nowadays, we often hear this argument that China needs a bigger nuclear arsenal because the US has changed its overall strategic approach towards China. US is adopting a much more hostile policy against China. This perception has less to do with American nuclear policy, but a lot to do with American policies on non-nuclear issues, including Xinjiang, Hong Kong, human rights, Taiwan, etc. But because of this threat perception that US is becoming now a strategic hostile rival for China, China needs a bigger arsenal simply to contain this perceived strategic hostility and to calm the United States, to deter the United States at the geopolitical level. I think that incentive also needs to be addressed. So I believe there's a lot we need to do, and compared with US-Russia, which made important progress in establishing the strategic stability dialogue, there is more to do between US and China. Both countries still share mutual suspicions about each other's commitment to bilateral strategic stability. So I hope this project, this dialogue will open the process of us examining these very important issues in a much more substantive manner. Thank you.
And if I may ask directly, Tung, do you think that this news from yesterday might have moved the possibility of US-China talks further away? It was already something that was not going to happen within the next year, but has this now significantly deteriorated the prospect for US-Chinese engagement on strategic stability issues?
My understanding is not necessarily so. China is building these nuclear missiles, in plain sight. It does not intend to hide these missile silos. It is to be discovered sooner or later. So I don't think this news will affect the prospect of bilateral talks. I think, as China receives more international pressure, including that from the United States, to engage on arms control issues, I wouldn't rule out that China, becoming more willing to engage with the Biden administration, which has adopted a more pragmatic approach on arms control than the previous American administration. I think arms control is a very politically loaded term. If China accepts to do arms control, it would be viewed as making a concession under US pressure. So in that sense, maybe a strategic stability talks is a better alternative, just like the US-Russian strategic stability dialogue. And we can discuss a lot under strategic stability, including new technologies, transparency, confidence building measures, and even potentially, how to mix different types of capabilities and think about limitations and even reductions on strategic weaponry. So I think there is a lot of potential. I'm keep my fingers crossed that we might see some progress in the near-term future.
Thank you so much also for explaining us the logics behind Chinese thinking on this. And let's give this back to Ambassador Bird. And I would also, again, welcome our participants to ask questions for Q&A or to raise your hand. Two questions to you, Ambassador Bird, one from the audience and one reacting to what Tung Zhao has said. What would you expect as a reaction from the United States to this news from yesterday? What would you recommend to Washington how to react to this? And then coming back to the summit, there was also a question from Amy Wolf in the Q&A who asks why there is so much emphasis on reaffirming the Reagan-Gorbachev statement, given that the context was different at the time. And she asks, will the reaffirmment of the statement really lead to any changes in postures or policies to reduce the risk? And if not, why has it been such a high priority in the analytical community? What would be your take on how important is the Reagan-Gorbachev statement actually?
Well, those are two very good questions, and I will try to be brief. In terms of the likely U.S. reaction to the Chinese decision on building these ICBM silos for deployment, first of all, I regret it, and I should just say, speaking for myself, I think it's not a very smart decision, because fixed land-based missiles are potentially destabilizing, especially in a crisis, because very accurate missiles can be used to attack those missiles, and so that leads to, in a crisis, a good deal of instability, where both sides are concerned that the other may go first. That's one reason why both the United States and in the Cold War, the Soviet Union deployed sea-based missile systems. It's why Russia today deploys land mobile systems, so as to avoid those first strike instabilities. Now, as you may be aware, in the United States right now, there is a debate on whether the United States needs to replace its small number of fixed site ICBM missiles with a new missile. And I think that would be also a mistake. But I'm afraid, particularly knowing the US Congress, that they will see the Chinese having taken this decision and use this principally as an argument for procuring a new land-based missile system. And so it'll just make the emerging strategic balance between the United States and China that much more precarious. So I regret the decision, and I'd really like to understand the strategic logic behind it, because it is a typical arms race, monkey see, monkey do kind of decision that will, in my view, turn out to be very counterproductive. The interesting thing about the second question about the Reagan-Gorbachev statement is that in many respects, I think that that statement was a reflection of a very different mood in the US-Soviet relationship in the late 1980s. And I don't know if Dmitry Trenin will agree with me, but in my view, and I was around then, that while both the United States and the Soviet Union had many more nuclear weapons then than they do today, the relationship, the political relationship between Reagan and Gorbachev, the political relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, and between the Europeans and the Soviet Union, was far better, was far more stable, was far more predictable than it is today. I think both sides at that point were kind of suffering, if I can use this phrase, with Cold War exhaustion. They had deployed thousands of more nuclear weapons than they needed. They spent billions of dollars on defense buildups. Both sides recognized that there were other needs that needed to be attended to. And there was, I think, a desire to find solutions to problems. I think the one thing that I think is sort of a positive note about the recent Biden-Putin meeting is, while it wasn't full of the kind of, I would say, sense of hope that you had from those Reagan-Gorbachev meetings, at least there was, I think, an exchange of views, and perhaps the establishment of a framework that will lead to progress over time, and maybe to a new sense of hope, because it doesn't seem to exist now. So the reason I think going back and extracting that statement at least showed that there was political, on both sides, a desire to try to find the kind of confidence and even trust that existed at that time that needs to be now regenerated.
Thank you. And Dimitri, would be interested in hearing what you think or whether you agree with Ambassador Bird, but I would also be interested in hearing your perspective on the news that China might be expanding its nuclear missile capabilities. We saw that in the aftermath of the Geneva meeting, there was this call between the Chinese and the Russian president extending the friendship treaty, not to first use nuclear weapons against each other. But this news must also be to some extent to concern Russia. Does it? And if yes, what measures does Russia take to address a growing Chinese nuclear arsenal?
Well, thank you, Liana. I wish I could wholeheartedly embrace what Ambassador Bird has said about the glimmer of hope that's contained in the reaffirmation of a statement that was made by Reagan and Gorbachev. I agree, in a wholly different environment. Putin, in his post-summit press conference, talked about glimmers of hope. I think I would take a more conservative view of that. I think that the meeting in Geneva was essentially about managing confrontation that is going to be with us for quite some time. It's open-ended. And maybe finding a way to regulate it better. So management is more like crisis management, and regulation is more like having agreements, understandings between the two parties. I think we're very far from anything that one can call trust, and I would focus on predictability, on a level of confidence that the other side is not about to kill you or is not about to provoke you, that would make you, that would put you in a position in which you would have to react militarily. I think we need to have a very sober look of where the US-Russian relationship is today. Frankly, I think that it's in a state that is more dangerous than the Cold War that we actually, people of my generation actually experienced. So from the Cuban Missile Crisis on, with the exception of 1983 maybe, a sense of a more or less stable adversarial relationship. The relationship today is anything but. It's adversarial, maybe more adversarial than the US-Soviet relationship was in the 60s and the 70s, but it's much less stable. So this whole business of stability is, the word stability is somehow foreign, at least to my view of where we are and what we should be focusing upon. I think we should very much focus on enhancing predictability by maintaining contact among the major powers at political, military, and security levels to avoid miscalculation and misperception. I think we need to avoid dangerous encounters of the kind that we have talked about just a couple of minutes ago that could lead to collision, acknowledging each other's red lines without accepting them necessarily. Maintaining emergency contacts between the relevant authorities to prevent and manage incidents when they happen so that they do not escalate. And maybe engaging in reciprocal and sometimes unilateral restraint vis-a-vis each other. I think that the goal is less to come up with a military balance, strategic balance. It's meaningless today. I don't think that counting weapons makes as much sense as it did during the Cold War. I think it's more about predictability and more about managing a very precarious situation that exists between the United States and Russia. And having lived through the Cold War, I would say that the period we're going through is much less stable and much less predictable, and thus much less dangerous than, let's say, the 70s, the 80s, or much of the 60s. With regard to the Chinese decision, the Russian strategic community treats China as a superpower of the 21st century. China and the United States are in a class of their own globally. So Russia has no illusions about where it stands in the world. On the other hand, I think there's confidence. I think there's enough confidence in the Russian leadership that for the foreseeable future, the Sino-Russian relationship will stay on an even keel. What you need to worry about in Russia is not so much Chinese attack against you. It could be a tighter embrace by China that would be the result of Russia not being able to perform well enough to keep some sort of a balance in its bilateral relationship with China. Russia is adamant about its own sovereignty. It's about its own status as a self-standing power. And as long as that is not in danger, a certain amount of dependence is tolerated. And I hope that the relationship will be more or less balanced in the foreseeable future. The existence of more nuclear weapons on the Chinese side is seen in the context of the evolving hostility between the United States and China. It will be seen as a Chinese response to essentially the United States under Trump and then confirmed under Biden, China being actually established as America's #1 competitor, rival, and potentially military foe. So I don't think that a lot of people will be too worried about. Everyone will clearly understand that. Everyone will clearly register that, and since people are not engaging in illusions about other great powers, people in the strategic community of Russia have a very realist world outlook. But for the foreseeable future, they will see China as not a threat to Russia.
Mm-hmm. So there seems to be little incentive for Russia to support efforts bringing in China. And there's also a comment from Andrei Baklitsky, who was a Russian participant to our initiative, who also mentioned that it was somehow lost in the news that the statement of the presidents of Russia and China that a nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought. So basically repeating the Gorbachev statement in a Russian-Chinese context, and he would also like to hear views of Tung Zhao and Ambassador Bird on it. But before we turn to this, let me turn to Mr. Bohn. I think you have a comment, and I would also like to add one more question to you, which goes concretely. You just mentioned at the beginning what Germany and Europe could do. There's this idea of the moratorium, if we talk about European security from the Russian side, which has been rejected by NATO, but is brought up again and again into the discussion. If this, from a European perspective, is not the way to go, what is the way to go? And I add one more question from the participants to you, Mr. Bohn. How do you think about the rejection of Angela Merkel's proposal to hold a summit with Russia? I alluded to it at the beginning of my question before. Shouldn't the EU follow the example of the US government? And what can Germany do to talk to skeptical EU member states about it?
Yes, thank you. Very briefly, I'd like to add just one perspective on the reconfirmation of the Reagan-Gorbachev principle. I think I can agree with almost everything that has been said so far. In addition, I'd say for us, the reconfirmation of the Reagan-Gorbachev principle is also important because it says that any kind of nuclear war cannot be warning, should not be fought, meaning also it's a clear statement or refusal of also the notion of a limited nuclear war, which is of course important. So also a war fought only by non-strategic or sub-strategic nuclear weapons cannot be fought, and that is important that we say yes, there is a threshold. Once you cross this threshold by using a nuclear weapon, even if it's only a small nuclear weapon, it is a deadly threshold that leads to a disastrous nuclear confrontation. And secondly, during recent years, we noticed that a number of countries, including the US, were reluctant to reconfirm what we call past commitments of the NPT process, the process of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, meaning the acquis that consists of lots of documents and action plans and important decisions. And by reconfirming this Reagan-Gorbachev principle, we see that the US and Russia are moving again back towards the NPT past commitments, which is extremely important, although it's just a declaratory policy, but it's important for strengthening the NPT process and the upcoming review conference. As to your question, the moratorium—
Just to add, Mr. Bohn, this is also so important because in Germany, the question whether Germany should join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it's also widely discussed and also a topic in the election campaign, right?
Which would be a third question. But starting with your first question, moratorium, I mean, I clearly have to say that if it comes to the nuclear field, the European security is clearly part of our NATO policy. We are members of NATO, and NATO made clear several times that the moratorium proposal by President Putin is not the way forward, because it would just perpetuate the status quo or preserve the status quo, which is that Russia has already a lot of dual-capable missiles and non-strategic weapons. And there's almost nothing in this respect in Western Europe, meaning it would simply perpetuate a situation that is not very advantageous for Western Europe. We think we have to go beyond the moratorium and really try to eliminate non-strategic weapons, not only in Europe but also, let's say, in the broader European area, let's say from Lisbon till Vladivostok, in order to be sure that there is no threat anymore to European countries through non-strategic weapons. And secondly, the summit idea launched by Germany and France that was refused, or at least could not be agreed upon within the EU. This is not directly referring, I think, to arms control and security. It was more the general approach to keep the dialogue with Russia going, to reopen a new channel, and to find a solution to the also tense relations between the EU and Russia. But of course, nuclear issues were not at the focus of this proposal. Your last question, support for, or the idea that Germany should join the TPNW. Again, we think that for us, the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is the framework for further arms control and disarmament in the nuclear sphere, meaning we see that we need a step-by-step approach. Whereas the TPNW is simply delegitimizing any kind of nuclear deterrence. and that will not lead to the reduction of any nuclear weapons in the not too distant future. So we think the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is the realistic framework. It's an almost universal framework to make disarmament steps, and not the TPNW. That is also not in keeping with our role as a NATO ally. But again, I think with regard to the future and also the NPT review conference that I already mentioned, it is important, I think, to see that we share the same goal with the TPNW, which is global zero. And we also try to build bridges and not to campaign against the TPNW, because this would be the end of the next review conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But again, it's not a realistic way forward. And it's also a pity that the NPT, the TPNW supporters have not created a credible and proper verification regime that could then underpin their demand for global zero. Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying Germany's position on this. And I think it will be interesting to observe how this develops also after the elections and with a new government in Berlin. But let me turn it over to Tung Zhao for one question. Perhaps you would like to address the question by our friend and colleague Andrei Baklitsky, why the Reagan-Gorbachev statement has been reaffirmed between Russia and China. And there's also one question to you, which also again brings up the possibility of a three-way strategic stability dialogue between the US, Russia, and China. And the concrete question is whether China would insist in the same way as Russia does on bringing the British and French into the discussion. Is this also a Chinese concern? Over to you, Tung.
Well, thank you, Liana, for the question. I think for some time, the debate over whether P5 should reiterate the Reagan-Gorbachev statement was used as a political tool to exchange accusations against each other. There for some time, US appeared reluctant to reiterate this statement. So I think Russia and China view this as an opportunity to bolster their image as responsible nuclear powers. Unfortunately, I think given the fact that US, Russia, during their presidential summit, jointly reiterated this statement, and now Russia and China have done the same. This creates the impression in the Chinese policy community that among the three major powers, the US and China were not able to reiterate these statements between themselves. And this was because the US does not want to pursue strategic stability with China. US still thinks that maybe nuclear war can happen with China. So unfortunately, this has strengthened the Chinese suspicion that US is fundamentally not yet committed to the common goal of a stable nuclear relationship with China. So that's that. Regarding your question about the format of negotiations, I do think in some cases it makes sense to have a trilateral discussion among US, Russia, and China, because and this would be in Chinese interests, because China as a newcomer to nuclear reduction or nuclear arms control talks, it would really benefit from having Russia on its side. And also because Russia and China share the very same concerns about American missile defense or conventional precision strike capabilities, they could make a joint case against the United States in a trilateral setting. And all these factors would strengthen China's negotiating position and leverage. But I think on other issues, it would make sense to include UK and France, such as on the discussion about the impact of emerging new technologies. How can the nuclear powers regulate the negative implications of potential new technologies? Because all the nuclear powers face these challenges, face these risks. So it would make sense for a multilateral platform to have this discussion. There are some issues that may be more suitable for US-China bilateral discussion. For example, China insists that US should adopt a no first use. So maybe it makes sense for US and China to have a bilateral discussion on how they can think about a bilateral mutual no first use commitment and how to make that commitment credible to both parties. So I think the format should be made flexible depending on what specific issues are addressed.
Thank you very much, Tung. There are actually a lot of questions coming in from the audience, so thanks so much for your active participation. I will probably not be able to address them all, but please feel free to type them into the Q&A. And there's one question specifically to you, Ambassador Bird, and I would also like to follow up with one question on the domestic debate in the United States. The first question to you, Ambassador, is from Sergei Utkin in Moscow. He asks that you spoke of the necessity to develop new verification techniques in case we include new types of weapons and arms control with regimes, but that at the moment it looks like politicians in all nuclear capable states are barely comfortable with the existing verification mechanisms. And he also adds that it's impossible to verify whether a launched dual-use missile is nuclear equipped or not. So Sergei Utkin asks, is there indeed a realistic, politically feasible potential, unused potential in verification? And let me also follow up with one question to you, Ambassador. There's also a debate in the US about the so-called sole purpose, that nuclear weapons can only be used in retaliation for a nuclear attack or to deter a nuclear attack. Biden has brought this up in his election campaign. How likely do you consider a shift in US doctrine towards this direction in the forthcoming nuclear posture review? I think, Ambassador, you have to unmute yourself, so you missed the first sentences.
I'm sorry for that. So those are two good questions. You know, I'm not too sure I share the premise, though, of the first question, which is that there's a great deal of political resistance against enhanced verification in various countries possessing nuclear weapons. Actually, I think historically, verification is one of the great success stories of strategic arms control. You go back to what the environment was like in the 1960s, and just as the strategic arms talks got underway in the late 1960s, the likelihood of the kind of verification regime that you see, for example, with New START would have been seen as impossible. The ability to actually go in, visit missile fields, actually count numbers of nuclear warheads deployed, that is remarkable progress in what I would argue is a relatively short period of time. When I was talking about the need for enhanced verification, what I was really focused on and going back was this idea of some more comprehensive limit on numbers of total nuclear warheads. And the only way, in my view, I think that would work is not only the ability to actually inspect deployed systems, but also be able to find a way of counting missiles held in reserve or in storage. That is going to be a much more difficult problem. Now, I am not an expert on how you would go about doing that, but I have spoken to technical experts in the United States at the nuclear labs like Los Alamos, who believe that there are technologies and there are ways in which you could have a credible verification system that would permit a comprehensive limit on total numbers of nuclear warheads. So I think it will require, though, a good deal of negotiation and a good probably a good deal of technical exchange between and among the various experts. So that is the problem with that issue. Now, what was the second question, though, you raised?
Sole purpose discussion in the United States.
Yes, that's a very delicate and tricky issue. And what I think it reflects is, frankly, going back to the last conversation we had with the Chinese desire to perhaps sit down with the U.S. side and talk about no first use. I think there are those people in the Democratic Party, on the Biden team, who would like to circumscribe the situations in which the United States, in terms of its nuclear doctrine, would or would not use nuclear weapons. That is a tough, difficult issue to take on. And I think while there's a very strong case to be made for it, because I think, and let's step back, and I'm speaking as an American, but also as a member of representing the sort of NATO community, Western community. The role of nuclear weapons has had to evolve over time. NATO adapted a nuclear strategy in the 50s and in the 60s, when we saw nuclear weapons as the response to Soviet conventional superiority. We don't face Russian conventional superiority in the same way that we did in the 50s and 60s. And that maybe suggests that we can safely place less reliance on the first use of nuclear weapons. However, I think at this point, for a new administration that is very ambitious and wants to accomplish things, both domestically and internationally, including with both Russia and China, I don't think that the Biden administration is likely, and under current circumstances, to try or make the effort to change existing nuclear doctrine.
Thank you, Ambassador, for this insight on this question. I would like to give one more question to you, Dimitri. At the Deputy Foreign Minister Rybkov at the Carnegie's International Nuclear Conference has mentioned that Russia might be open to packages of measures which can include potentially different status of agreements. And there's also a question from the chat, which comes from, let me check, from Tim Tees, who asks, which types of weapon systems are suitable for formal arms control agreements, and what sort of capabilities can be better dealt through more informal measures? Is this the way to go, that we will have in the future a mixture of packages, informal, formal, which Sergei Rybkov also alluded to?
Well, Liana, I think that call them packages, call them something else. One would have to face the reality of some systems that are non-nuclear having strategic capabilities and being regarded de facto as strategic weapons, whereas some sub-strategic weapons would have a nuclear weapon as part of the system, and they clearly are in the top category of concerns of the other side. So there has to be, I think, for a viable compromise, there has to be a willingness by both sides to look at the other side's principal concerns. And here is the asymmetry. The Soviet-American nuclear balance was not completely symmetrical, but there was much more symmetry to it than the current situation. And geopolitically, geostrategically, there's far less symmetry now between the United States and Russia. So that's one thing. Another thing is that I believe we carry with us the legacy of instruments that were used during the Cold War. There's a whole culture of arms control with treaties ratified, implemented, verified, and all that. I'm not sure that the entire toolbox, or even most of the toolbox that served the United States and Russia reasonably well during the Cold War, particularly in the later stages of the Cold War, when the war itself was melting and melting fast in front of our eyes, or becoming warmer. Let's say strategic warming was taking place. And of course, that ended in the meltdown of the Soviet Union itself, as we all remember. So I don't think that we would necessarily need to have that toolbox in mind. Again, in the days of the Cold War, a lot was about parity, numbers, and other more or less formal comparisons between the arsenals of the United States and Russia. I'm not sure that this is of as much importance today as it used to be. Also, looking at the American political scene, frankly, I'm not sure that treaties negotiated by the United States with Russia would have a good chance of being ratified in the United States Senate. And you have to look at the ferocity of internal American politics, which is not going away if you look at some of the news coming from the United States. So you have to factor that in. So maybe we will have to come up with a very different structure of strategic arrangements. Again, the word stability, I don't think belongs here really, but strategic arrangements that would prevent the United States and Russia in this situation from actually, going to war. That's the issue. Again, if we take the nuclear out of the equation, or pretend to take the nuclear out of the equation and agree on, let's say, never using nuclear weapons on the battlefield, well, that certainly would be advantageous to the side, in this case, the United States and NATO, that has a much more effective and much bigger arsenal of non-nuclear systems. And frankly, in major power military engagements, I would doubt that any side would concede defeat on more than a local scale to its opponent without using nuclear weapons. And whether you have arrangements, pre-existing arrangements or not, whether you issue those statements, reissue them, Reagan, Gorbachev, what have you. When push comes to shove and you face more than a local defeat, I wonder what happens. But I would not guarantee that just because there was a formal reaffirmation of the statement from 1985, you would just sit on your nuclear arsenal and not make use of that while you have to concede a major defeat. So we live in a very different world than the world of the Cold War.
That's a very bleak outlook, perhaps realistic, but on which I do not want to end this discussion as we are reaching the end and running out of time. But instead, I would like to have one concluding answer from all of you, starting with you, Rudiger Bohn, to one short question, and please just answer with 1 or 2 sentences. So if suddenly a good fairy came to you and you had one wish, that you can have one new arms control treaty, what kind of treaty would you ask for and what would it have to address? Rudiger Bohn.
Of course, as a European, I would like to have a new arms control treaty that would somehow address and solve the problem of non-strategic weapons, as strategic weapons are so to speak, under control for the next 5 years. But non-strategic weapons, that is the challenge. And there I would like to see a treaty.
Tung Zhao, what would be your wish?
Well, as Chinese like to say, we prefer behavioral arms control over numerical arms control. Personally, I would think it would be great to have an agreement that all state parties commit to not to use military means to resolve their territorial disputes in the Asia-Pacific region. I think that's the major driving force behind the recent emerging arms race. I think that type of political commitment would be really helpful in mitigating that effect.
Thank you, Tung. Ambassador Bird, what would be your wish?
Well, I disagree with Dmitry Trenin. I don't think that nuclear war in any circumstance today is more likely than it has been in the past. What could make it likely is if one or another country believes that it can succeed in a nuclear attack. So that leads me to conclude that I'd like to see a renegotiation and an updating and modernization of the ABM treaty.
Dmitry, you have the final wish.
Well, you called my assessment bleak, but it was much bleaker a few months ago. But some of my wishes did come true. The New START treaty has been extended. Dialogue on strategic stability has been launched, at least formally authorized. And thirdly, something I have not hoped for is a willingness to engage in dialogue on cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. So I think that with goodwill on both sides, in this case, the United States and Russia, we can advance to a more predictable relationship, a relationship in which the threat that I mentioned, and Ambassador Bird disagreed with how realistic or how likely that incidents would be, that threat would not come up, and even I would not mention it.
Thank you so much. We've reached the end of our discussion. We didn't even have the chance to dig deeper into cyber issues, but I hope we can continue this conversation. It was fascinating to have you all with us and to conduct this discussion. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to all our participants for joining us. Thank you to everyone who was involved in this project and also in this event. And please do take a look at the website, www.strategicstability.org. We are looking forward to your feedback. And with this, I wish you a wonderful evening, afternoon, or morning, wherever you are. Stay tuned, stay healthy, and thank you again, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.